Before I start, let me tell you something about myself. I'm from Saudi Arabia. I lived there, I grew up there, and I came to Britain in 1983 to pursue higher education. I was an undergraduate. I finished my undergraduate degree. I went on to write a PhD. And after finishing my PhD, somehow the Saudi regime found out that I wrote this PhD, and it was just about to be published. So they dug up the manuscript of my PhD from Cambridge University Library. They translated it into Arabic and sent it to the governor of Riyadh, who is now King Salman of Saudi Arabia. After reading that PhD manuscript, he called my father and said to him, "Do you know what your daughter has done? She has written this awful PhD that tarnishes the reputation of our country and our great founder, King Ibn Saud, the one who founded Saudi Arabia." So my father dismissed that phone call, and I went ahead and published my PhD, and it came as my first book under the title Politics in an Arabian Oasis. So far, during the last 24 hours, we talked about journalists and the plight of journalism in the modern world. We heard examples from all over the world about how journalism is now under threat. Well, many journalists are probably under threat in the world, but I would like to share with you a story that you might have followed, and I'm sure a lot of people did follow it. On the 2nd of October last year, a journalist by the name of Jamal Khashoggi, he is a Saudi journalist who had worked all his life serving the Saudi regime. He was a journalist writing in official newspapers. He was so close to power. He worked for several princes. But since 2015, when the new king came, he became persona non grata. The new king brought his own people, as most kings do, and dismissed Khashoggi from his job. Khashoggi stayed in his home, completely isolated and marginalized at age 59. He decided to migrate to the United States. He arrived in Washington in 2017 and also started writing opinion essays in the Washington Post. He was not a dissident, a revolutionary, or a rebel. He was simply a journalist who felt that there is a serious change happening in Saudi Arabia. Most of his friends were put in prison. So it didn't take long before the Saudi regime organized the murder of this journalist, and it was, I would say, the murder of the century. Jamal Khashoggi went to Istanbul, where he had met a woman who he wanted to marry. To be able to marry, he had to obtain a document from the embassy of Saudi Arabia in Istanbul to clarify his marital status, to say that he is not a polygamous man. He hasn't got 2 or 3 wives in Saudi Arabia. In fact, he was divorced. And he had an appointment on Tuesday, the 2nd of October, to go to the Saudi consulate and obtain that document. He went with Khadija, his Turkish fiancée, who I interviewed just a couple of months ago. He gave her his 2 phones and told her to wait for him outside the embassy door. He walked in and he never came out. A series of lies by the Saudi regime started. First, we were told that he left the consulate 3 hours after he had entered it. And of course, he didn't leave, although the Saudi government released a video to show that a man dressed up in Khashoggi's clothes did actually leave the consulate, but it wasn't Jamal Khashoggi. Later on, the United Nations Special Rapporteur, Agnes Kalamar, reached the conclusion in June 2008 that Jamal Khashoggi was murdered, his body was chopped up, and the murder took place as the work of at least 15 Saudi operatives who had flown from Riyadh to Istanbul, including a forensic doctor, And on the basis of the recording that she was able to access, she reached the conclusion that the new Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, is responsible and he should be under investigation. Of course, the world didn't take notice, but thanks to the global human rights organization and their pressure, we were able to have this report and this investigation. So this is just one of the Saudi lies, the denial of murdering this journalist. But there are others. The Saudi regime, as you know, is an absolute monarchy with no representation for people. There's no elected parliament, no separation of powers, no freedom of speech, and obviously no elected government. The problem with this system is that since 2015, it has become a one-man rule, which means that the Sun King, the king's son, Mohammed bin Salman, the future king, the future monarch, is going to be with us for a very long time. What is really amazing is that since 2015, and before the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, in October 2018, for 3 years, we have heard lies also by journalists who should be respected journalists working in global media. I give you 2 examples. Yesterday, we talked about how journalists are under threat, but today, I'm going to tell you about how Western journalists are actually co-opted by the Saudi regime to provide us with a narrative that washes all these kind of lies and crimes that take place in Saudi Arabia. So, David Ignatius of the Washington Post, where Jamal Khashoggi actually ended up writing opinion essays, said that after visiting Saudi Arabia, he was saying in these reports that he was providing for Western readers that Riyadh is a huge city, the capital, snailed by traffic with oversized villas for wealthy Saudis and their family. But this city has the glitz of a modern metropolis. You can't find cinemas, nightclubs, or art museums in Riyadh. But now, under the rule of the Sun King, Mohammed bin Salman, he's opening up, and what we are witnessing is a top-down revolution. Simply because Mohammed bin Salman allowed women to drive, opened cinemas, theaters, concerts, and circuses under what is called the Entertainment Authority. The Financial Times said that Mohammed bin Salman, the murderer I referred to, is a man to do business with. But listen to what Thomas Friedman, the famous imperial messenger of the New York Times, said about Mohammed bin Salman just months before the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. So he says, "We met at night." He is referring to his meeting, famous or infamous meeting with Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince. "We met at night at his family's adobe-walled palace north of Riyadh. MBS spoke in English while his brother and several senior ministers shared different lamb dishes and spiced the conversation. After nearly 4 hours together, I surrendered at 1:15 a.m. to MBS's youth, pointing out that I was exactly twice his age. It's been a long time, though, since any Arab leader wore me out with a fire hose of new ideas about transforming his country." Several months after that interview, we came face to face with murder in the consulate. But this kind of propaganda didn't actually stop at journalism. Even academia got involved, and many academics in the US, the UK, and many other countries started talking about this top-down revolution when Saudi Arabia is being transformed by the new Crown Prince. However, nobody told us about what was going on inside Saudi Arabia among real people. The problem is Western journalists have limited access to Saudi Arabia, and if they want to travel to the country, they have to go through the government. And once they arrive there, they are handed over to the Ministry of Information, and they have fixers who take them to specific individuals to talk. They're not allowed to just simply go into shopping center and grab a Saudi and have a conversation with. And if they do, most Saudis would refuse to talk to them, simply because if you are not authorized to talk to foreign journalists, you can be in prison. And if you do, there is a heavy price to pay. And this is what happened to my colleague and friend, Dr. Hatoun Al-Fassi, who is an archaeologist and worked in Saudi Arabia. She gave an interview immediately after women were allowed to drive in Saudi Arabia, and without authorization. And she ended up in prison for 18 months almost, and then she was released, and she is now under travel ban because the court case is not finished yet. So if we're thinking about Saudi Arabia, we're thinking here about two phenomena that are going hand in hand. The first one is the so-called reforms of Mohammed bin Salman, and the second one is real repression. It is very easy to provoke the Saudi regime. A 140-word tweet might end you in prison. If you write a blog that is critical of the government, you will actually be detained. So the reform that we are talking about is actually a lie if we believe that it's coming from the top down. Saudi society had been so vibrant, and its youth have been so active on social media, on all sorts of new communication technology, to organize themselves in ways that are novel and creative. So when we have a flourishing art scene in Saudi Arabia, and it's been going on before Mohammed bin Salman came to power, but when he arrived, he appropriated and co-opted that art scene. Women, feminists who had campaigned for two important rights, and that is the right to move around, and that is to lift the ban on driving. And the second one was to lift the ban, the guardianship system, which is an interesting system that deprives women of being a legal person. So if a woman wants to marry, even now, with the so-called reforms, she has to have the consent of her father, even if she's an adult woman. After divorce, women do not have any right to keep the children. Custody over children is extremely important. If a woman goes to prison for whatever reason, she cannot be released until her male guardian comes and signs the form. So she goes from the patriarchy of her family to the patriarchy of the state, then back to the patriarchy of the family. If women are abused sexually, physically, they go and report cases to the police. They are kept at the police station. They are not released until their guardian comes and takes them. And imagine if the guardian is the abuser. So there are many lies about this reform, but the repression is actually become extremely obvious, and people are paying a high price. To just give you an indication, in Australia, there are probably 200 Saudi students who had asked for asylum. The number of asylum seekers from Saudi Arabia, which is a country we do not associate with producing refugees or asylum seekers, has increased by 318% since Mohammed bin Salman arrived in power. So the lies continue, but the Saudi regime is producing serious flows of intelligent, educated people who cannot live there anymore simply because their political and civil rights are actually violated. Another lie, which might be interesting to you, and that is the Saudi regime declared itself as the bastion of tolerant Islam with Mohammed bin Salman. Of course, the name of Saudi Arabia is associated with exporting radical Islamic interpretations that had precipitated the global jihad movement in the 1980s during the Afghan war. And this particular brand of Islam is known as Wahhabiyya. It is actually the state religion. And for decades, in fact, for like 250 years, it's been the dominant religious interpretation that the successive Saudi regimes adopted. But recently, Mohammed bin Salman wanted to endear himself to the West because he needs the West for his economic plans, attracting global capital, and also making his economic privatization program work. So he told reporters that he is now the champion of moderate Islam. If you want to create moderate Islam, you cannot put religious scholars in prison. And now we have hundreds of religious scholars who might contribute to a debate about Islam and different interpretations of Islam are actually in prison. He presents himself as a partner against terrorism, but we all know that the religious roots of that terrorism that sprung in the 1980s originated nowhere but in Saudi Arabia. Another lie is that Saudi Arabia is a partner against Iran, which is extremely important in Trump discourse in America and elsewhere. So if Saudi Arabia is a capable partner against Iran, then why do we have Saudi oil fields attacked by Iran with no defenses put to stop that? For the West, I need to conclude, for Australia and for the rest of the world, it is actually in the national interest of a country like Australia as much as it is in the national interest of the US and other Western countries to stop their unconditional support for a regime that not only terrorizes its own people, but also causes regional instability. And I will give the example of the Yemen war, where in the past 5 years, Saudi Arabia had been bombing the poorest Arab country, precipitating a humanitarian crisis and a famine. Thank you very much.